我想要当一个好爸爸，我需要财富，我想要纹身，我想要爬山，我想要飞翔，我想要赚很多钱，
想要长大，
我渴望自由，我想要旅行，
想要当个厉害的人。
有什么话想说？有什么梦？
Welcome to the fourth event of the Smart City Online Education Inside series. Smart City Online Education Inside is a joint project between the Digital Education Institute of III and the Talent Circulation Alliance. Under the supervision of the Bureau of Industrial Development, Taiwan, we are launching a series of panel and speech events for everyone who is interested in education technology, sustainable learning, and sustainable society. This week of events has covered topics like STEAM, trending education, and sustainable social topics, such as what we are going to talk about today: basic income and its influence on child development. Joining us today is Kline, who is a former director of the San Francisco Office of Financial Empowerment, where he leveraged the power of City Hall to strengthen economic security and mobility for low-income residents. Sean is a leading voice for basic income in the United States. He's co-author of Basic Income in Cities, a guide to city experiments and pilot projects, published by the National League of Cities. And in 2017, he led a $100 million proposal to the MacArthur Foundation to fund a large-scale, child-focused basic income study in the cities of San Francisco, Detroit, and New Haven. I'm speaking with Sean today about child development in the digital era. Thanks, Sean, for joining us.
Happy to join you.
So the first question I have is, what critical economic challenge do we face today?
Well, as we've shifted in developed economies significantly to services, and technology has become a dominant driver, it's become glaringly apparent that some segments of the population in some places have actually been left behind. And specifically, that's places like smaller cities and towns, especially those from an earlier industrial era. Certainly in the North American context, Canada, the United States, people of color, immigrants, and those with less education. So I think we can all recognize that societal gains from technology are astounding, and we wouldn't want to diminish that. But we need a more modern and robust social safety net to help transition and adapt to this rapid technological change. There was growing recognition of economic insecurity even before COVID, and the cost of economic security to city budgets in the United States. And as you mentioned, I was previously in San Francisco City Hall. And for example, economic insecurity was estimated to have cost the city $50 to $70 million in 2019. And that's just from loss of property tax and utility bills alone. That doesn't include the cost to house, treat, hospitalize, or otherwise support those experiencing homelessness, or other challenges as a result of economic security. So we know the costs are really high, and we know it's time to change the social safety net we need. And I anticipate that I'm hoping COVID really accelerates our thinking about both the future of work, our social safety net, the contract between workers and employers, and kind of our future economic development and direction.
I know you've been an advocate for unconditional cash to assist people. Can you explain why you think cash specifically is important?
Sure. I'll step back for a moment. I spent a decade and a half building the field of microfinance, this field in which was really intended to respond to banking that had left low-income people all around the world behind. So small savings, loans, remittances. And two developments, while I was active in that field of microfinance, two developments led me more directly to cash. Of course, microfinance is all about cash. But now 10 randomized control trial evaluations later, since I began my work in microfinance, has confirmed that while small loans, savings, and remittances are really helpful to low-income people, low and moderate-income people, it's not, in general, transformative of their lives. The claim for many years was that microfinance was lifting people out of poverty. And many who are watching this webinar right now may recognize places like Bangladesh in Asia and Bolivia in Latin America as sort of the places where microfinance was born. And microfinance remains hugely popular and a massive phenomenon in Bangladesh. But despite all the claims by organizations there and across the world that microfinance is moving people out of poverty, I think the rigorous research to date suggests that's really not the case, at least for most people. So that was one point in which I had to kind of pause in my sort of zeal for, particularly for lending money to low-income people. The other issue that led me to cash in aid was an organization called Give Directly. For those who may be on this webinar and don't know Give Directly, they're an international nonprofit organization that provides direct, unconditional cash to very poor households across Africa. And they do it digitally. They provide actual phones to the families, and they provide monthly payments to those families. And as you may imagine, the cost of living in someplace like Taipei or New York City or London or San Francisco is entirely different than the cost of living not only in Nairobi, Kenya, but in very rural villages across Kenya or Tanzania. So the bang for your buck, if you will, is pretty profound. And Give Directly is very committed to rigorous research. And to date, they have a tremendous amount of research that suggests that giving people unconditional cash is very powerful. So there's a large and growing body of evidence going back decades about the positive impacts of providing both unconditional and conditioned cash. Meaning, unconditional cash is where you give someone or a family money, but you're not asking anything in return. Completely no strings attached. Conditional cash transfers are those in which you're asking the participants, the recipients, in fact, to take some action. And there's actually a lot of positive evidence for conditional cash as well as unconditional cash. So examples of conditional cash include things like asking families who receive cash to take their children to receive health checkups at the local health clinic, or to ensure that their children are attending school. And then there's an interesting hybrid of providing unconditional cash, but framing the use of that cash to the recipients. So for example, there's an interesting study from Morocco where the Moroccan government provided cash directly to low-income families, no strings attached, but they described it as an educational investment fund, meaning they encourage families by describing it in a way that suggests it's for education to invest in children's education. And sure enough, the vast majority of recipients of that cash, the families, invested it in their children's education. So there's a lot of really interesting kind of approaches to this. And I'll add as well that I think what's really powerful about cash and something worthy of discussion among city and federal policymakers is what signal it sends to recipients of cash when you condition it or provide it unconditionally. I think, there's this question of giving money to someone and trusting that they know how to best use that cash. And again, the evidence is kind of far and away suggests that those who receive unconditional cash, by and large, most of the time, use it in their best interest and improve their well-being and their family's well-being. So to give you just an example of that sort of difference between giving money and trusting people know how to use it and not trusting people to use cash. Public benefits in the United States context, for many, many decades, has put tremendous conditions on how families can use the money. And that's for low income and middle income people. At the same time, the federal government has for decades provided a fantastically large tax deduction on the interest that people like myself pay on our mortgage. And yet, I'm not asked to provide a sample or a urine sample or jump through hoops. So it's a really striking example of a way in which policy reflects kind of trust for one group and mistrust for the other. And I think we're really at an inflection point in looking at additional cash around the world that's raising sort of a debate about what it means to provide unconditional cash. And then two last points I'll say, and this is a really obvious one, and for those who are listening right now who are in a position of administering programs, we know that government is, at any level, is very complex, but that governments are capable of giving people money, or taking money for that matter, in the form of taxes. Unconditional cash is administratively easier to deliver, especially if it's provided universally, right? So if you're not means testing and providing conditions, you can give it away, provided you've got a bank account or a debit card or a pay card or some means of getting the money to someone. And if you provide it to everyone, that reduces the administrative barrier even more. And then just lastly, kind of to the theme of this discussion about the digital era, I think many who are listening right now will recognize that digital cash is growing fantastically. There was already a move to adopt and promote digital forms of cash even before COVID, that I think COVID is sort of bringing into stark relief the need to consider new ways of making cash digital, but not leaving behind those who are so accustomed to using physical cash. So central banks, for example, are their own e-currencies. The rise of mobile payments and the turn away from cash has central banks scrambling, in fact, to figure out their role in this new digital money landscape. Some are really kind of keeping pace with developments and others are behind. And those who are keeping pace, I think, are really exploring the design of their own digital payment networks to retain control of their monetary systems. One idea is to issue central bank digital currencies that would only exist on a computer chip rather than as a coin or a bill. And the coronavirus, as I said, is added urgency as more people shop online or pay with contactless cards or phones rather than physical cash. And as you can imagine, it's in government's best interest to really be able to track who's receiving money they're sending to and who they're receiving money from in the form of taxes as quickly as possible in a digital fashion.
Can you speak a little bit more on this idea of trust? When you put conditions or don't put conditions on the cash, does that actually change the way that the recipients feel about the cash? Does it change their behavior in any significant way beyond just the condition?
Well, I think we have some evidence to reference here. First of all, I think we know that how recipients of money are treated from a public policy standpoint has an impact on how they perceive the role of government. And we're at a time, certainly in the United States, tremendous mistrust of virtually all government. And I think, during this time of COVID, we're finding people who are struggling to pay for their basic needs, really trying to make sense of the fact that the government is supposed to be governing their lives to some extent and providing support in times of need, and yet they're having to face all kinds of conditions. Unemployment insurance right now, for example, is a complete mess in the United States. We have millions and millions of people unemployment at a scale we have not seen for decades in my lifetime. And I think there's just a growing resentment about the kind of conditions and the delays of that money. So for example, unemployment insurance for those who've been impacted by COVID and lost their jobs isn't paid out first and then verified later, which we're fully capable of doing. Our government's fully capable of doing that. In fact, you're verified as you apply for the money, which has resulted in tremendous delays. So I think to your question, it certainly does matter that if people are asked a lot of questions and scrutinized in a way that they look around and see middle and upper middle class people aren't scrutinized, it lays bare sort of a real chasm between kind of who we judge worthy of government support and who we don't.
So let's redirect it to children specifically. Why have children been an important focus of your work, and how might cash support children in the digital age?
Well, I don't think I have to tell anyone who's on this webinar right now the most obvious point, but I'll state it just as sort of a foundational start to this part of our conversation. Children are clearly an investment in the future. There's growing evidence about the connection between wealth and children's physical health, including their early brain development, their stress levels, and how that really has an impact on their life trajectory and their economic opportunity. So one thing that's, I think, really powerful is to recognize, based on a lot of research to date, and that is that we know that when young people start life with few assets, they tend to end life with few assets. In America, we've been grappling for decades with a growing wealth gap. That is, a growing gap between those who have and continue to grow their assets and those who start life with few assets and are unable to grow their assets. And in fact, we saw the Great Recession back in 2008 and 2009 set many families, particularly families of color and low income, back many, many years in home ownership, savings, and other assets. The current pandemic is likewise, I'm afraid, widening the gap between those able to cope with the economic crisis that has resulted from this health crisis and those who aren't. So I think as a foundational principle, children are really, our investment or lack of investment in children not only sets a powerful not only kind of shape their life trajectory, but shape the trajectory of our potential economic growth as a society decades ahead. Now, in terms of what cash can do to support child development, I'll highlight 3 examples that I think are exciting, and I think we're seeing interesting kind of policy developments all around the world, certainly in more industrialized countries, like in Asia. One is something that I have a lot of experience with, and that's called a universal children's savings account. In San Francisco, we developed the first and largest publicly funded children's savings account program in the United States. And that was essentially to identify all of the children in the public school system entering school and kindergarten. And when that happened, the city sent a letter to those families of those children, basically saying, welcome to kindergarten, welcome to the school system, and congratulations on sending your child to college or some other post-secondary education. To support that endeavor, we've opened the child savings account for that education, and we put some money in, and we have incentives to help you save to contribute to that fund. And at this point, there's close to 50,000 children in San Francisco's public school system that have those accounts. And that program was really developed around early evidence about 8 to 10 years ago that suggested that when children had even a very small amount of money in their name dedicated to education, they were 5 to 7 times more likely to pursue post-secondary education. They didn't even need to have the full tuition when that time came. That's a whole nother challenge I think the United States and some other countries face that we're gonna have to grapple with. But it at least gets children, particularly low-income children, again, who are less likely to pursue post-secondary education, to the starting line, if you will. Because if they're not even at the starting line believing and having their families believe that they can pursue post-secondary education, then the game's over, right? And I know Taiwan has an example of a children's savings account program. If I understand correctly, in 2018, the Act on Savings Accounts for Education and Development of Children and Teenagers was passed, which encourages disadvantaged families to save for their children's future by publicly subsidizing savings accounts. So it's a similar structure, and I think countries like Taiwan, the United States, Israel, and numerous other countries around the world are kind of sharing what I wouldn't call best practice yet, since it's still early days, but certainly sound practices as we continue to develop more research. The second area I'll talk about is something that is commonly referred to as baby bonds. The idea here is that rather than providing a savings account and asking families to invest significantly into those accounts with government incentives, to in fact actually use public dollars to invest significant amounts in accounts for children, such that when a child reaches the age of, say, 18, they may have 30, 40, 50, 70,000 US dollars in their account to pursue post-secondary education, which we know is very expensive in the North American context, to buy a home, which is a major asset that can really move you, really shape your life trajectory, start a business, or even pay off debt or address sort of your assets in another way. This never would have gotten attention, I'd say, 10 years ago. But again, given this growing racial wealth gap, certainly in the US context, I think it's getting renewed interest and attention. And in fact, right before I left San Francisco City Hall a few months ago, the Urban Institute, a US think tank, had submitted a proposal for $10 million to the MacArthur Foundation to invest large sums of money in a sample of students of the Children's Savings Account program that I mentioned, with the idea of researching it and adding to the evidence base. And really going back, and with that evidence, going beyond cities to make the case that federal governments are the best place to be investing significant amounts of money in low-income children's future. The last area I'll speak to, I think, is universal basic income that benefits children. Now, I think there are three important kind of lenses on how you could invest. You could provide unconditional cash to families to support children. One is a policy in which is child explicit, meaning the funds go directly to a child or to a family who have 1, 2, or 3 children. So it's very explicitly targeting families with children and making clear that this money is in large part to support those children. A second kind of lens on this would be a child-conscious policy. That is, the funds might be provided to families with children, but without necessarily calling out children explicitly as something that the money can be used to invest in. And then lastly is a child-neutral policy in which you're providing unconditional cash either at the family level or to individuals without any mention or consideration of children necessarily. I think all three have the potential to positively impact children, but there's important policy implications, I think, to framing in those three different ways. And likewise, I think policymakers could be thinking about unconditional cash to families, particularly to parents that are race explicit, race conscious, or race neutral. So again, similarly, does the policy take into consider race explicitly such that the policy is intending to address families of color who have historically had fewer assets and are seeing kind of are facing greater challenges to build assets relative to their white peers, or a race-conscious policy in which you're not calling out race explicitly, but you're framing the basic income in a way that targets low-income families, which we know are going to be predominantly families of color. And then there's, of course, the race-neutral approach, which certainly any universal basic income policy would be. It'd be providing to everyone. You wouldn't be calling out anyone in particular. Now, the proposal that you mentioned at the start of this webinar that I submitted to the MacArthur Foundation on behalf of San Francisco, Detroit, and New Haven was really focused on investing in children and seeing children as an economic opportunity, both for the family, for the country, and for those children specifically. It was intended to provide cash families with children from 0 to 3 years of age. And the reason we identified that age group is because, as you might imagine, changes in children's physical development, particularly their brain development, is profound at that age. So any research you do to evaluate what kind of impact an infusion of cash to a family for children has, you're going to see, you're apt to see fairly dramatic results among those children for that age group. Also, investing in children is not very controversial. I think it's hard for any policymakers or anyone else for that matter really to argue that investing in children is a bad thing. So it's, I think, widely accepted as a good investment. And that's why we see things like widely accepted of universal childcare or universal education and public education. Now, momentum in the US is growing for a form of basic income, even if it's not necessarily called basic income. It might be called something else for political or other reasons. A recent Stanford study showed that people are warming up to this idea of a universal basic income, or UBI. In April of this year, 88% of liberals in the United States backed it, while support among conservatives rose from 28% before COVID-19 to 45%. So it's a pretty dramatic change from what we've seen as a really fringe idea 5 or 10 years ago. And rather than view basic income as a dramatic shift from policies we have in the US right now, I think there are a number of paths to a basic income that will seem much less threatening to policymakers and to residents across the country. People on the webinar may or may not be aware of a program in the United States called the Earned Income Tax Credit, but essentially is a way for the government to provide essentially a rebate on taxes to those who earn very, very low incomes. Now, it's conditioned on employment. But you could ask the question, could we not use the infrastructure and the policy as it is for this current policy by expanding the definition of employment? Could you expand this earned income tax credit to those who provide childcare uncompensated, or to those who are students and not currently working? So you could see ways in which the policy could really not diverge dramatically, but start to incrementally build out to be something less conditional, less stringent, to provide low-income people really the boost they need. Another example is what many countries have, and in the United States it's referred to as Social Security. It's really essentially a basic income for those above a certain age, 62 or 65. And there's a whole infrastructure and mechanism to get those checks out every month, because older people who are retired count on those checks, or digital cash as the case may be. So you could imagine a case where, what if you lowered the Social Security age to 40, to 30, to 20? There'd be people certainly questioning that, but I think at least you're starting from a reference point that many, many people are familiar with and highly supportive of. And then lastly, I mentioned sort of unemployment insurance. Right now, in response to COVID, the federal government is sending out stimulus checks with no questions asked to everyone. And they're providing unemployment insurance with fewer restrictions than they normally would. You could imagine a case where even fewer restrictions are asked, and the same mechanism is used to provide cash, if not completely unconditionally, less conditioned. And incrementally, we start to build to a place where the government's policy looks a lot more trusting, a lot more universal, and builds a universal constituent that's hard to claw back later. And just like Social Security now is virtually untouchable in the United States, it just has too large a constituency because it is universal in fact.
Can you speak a little bit about the inequality in education as far as children who go with cash and without cash? You mentioned that you have this program where you're giving kids cash to start out, and then it's meant to perhaps be used on college later. But what about during that period of time when they're in school? How does a lack of cash affect a child's education?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, it's one thing to talk about the future benefits of cash on children, but tens of millions of children in the United States, shamefully, are right now facing food insecurity. So we know from a lot of evidence that if children don't get the nutrients they need, they simply don't learn the way they should. And that's why in the United States, for many, many decades, there's been free and reduced lunch provided to children. And one of the big concerns about COVID and stopping school for children is that actually that also means children that don't have enough to eat at home aren't able to go to school to get the food that they need. Not only that, they're actually not out of the home and facing abuse and other problems that are associated with the household sometimes. So I think there's a very real and pressing need to consider the impact of cash on families and in turn children right now in terms of food insecurity, in terms of supplies for schools, and in terms, honestly, of signaling and providing confidence to parents that they can provide the basic necessities to their children, and their children can focus on learning at a time when they really need to focus on learning, rather than facing increased stress and all of the negative outcomes that are associated with that.
So we're going to turn to our audience questions. The first is a little bit along the lines of what I just asked, but I want to know if you have some research maybe that can help us. So the question is, can you tell us more about how UBI could help shorten the educational achievement gap? Is there any research that shows when you give this cash infusion from the government, what kind of impacts does it have in terms of changes on the child's behavior and perhaps their educational experience?
Well, UBI is still a relatively new idea, and the fact that U as universal basic income is something we actually haven't seen yet. The evidence is not there yet on that front. I think what we do have is, as I said, evidence around food security and other sort of critical brain development concerns and issues that children have as they're developing. So if the household does not have enough food to eat and children don't have enough food to eat, you're already in trouble. And as I said, children who start life with few assets tend to end life with few assets. So if the family doesn't have many assets to invest in the children, you can imagine they're not well positioned for economic opportunity going forward. And those tend to be the same children who drop out prematurely from elementary and high school. They don't get their post-secondary education, be it a 4-year degree, 2-year degree, apprenticeship, coding boot camp, what have you. And we know, despite the cost, the growing cost of post-secondary education, we know that post-secondary education is sort of the baseline these days for upward mobility. So if you miss that degree or certificate, you are really in a tough spot. And I think it's safe to say that the future of work is likely to see a dramatic increase in use of artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, all technological change that thus far we can see is disadvantaging those with less education. So the question of policymakers is, how can we address this education gap? And how can we equip young people for the jobs of the future? But even more importantly, how can policy remain nimble to equip people as lifelong learners to be able to adapt in this kind of rapidly changing labor market as a result of technology, trade, and now, as we see, pandemics?
I think that transitions well into the next question about competitiveness and eagerness to work. So what do we know about receiving these cash transfers and the eagerness to work, and how it might affect a city's competitiveness if they send out these kinds of cash transfers?
It's an important question because it goes to the heart of, I think, one key criticism of providing unconditional cash as a basic income, and that is that it disincentivizes work. To date, we actually have very little evidence that that's the case. In the limited experiments of basic income we have, for example, there's a town in Manitoba, Canada, for which there was rigorous research done during the 70s of a basic income provided to the entire town. So in that sense, it was a universal basic income. Everyone in the town got it. Now, any of the policymakers in our virtual room here will appreciate that the basic income experiment and research was started, and midway through, a new government came into power and ended the research. So we had tens and hundreds of boxes of data sitting in a government basement for decades until Professor Forget, this Canadian researcher, found the funding and wherewithal to pull them out and start looking at the data. And it was fascinating what she found. Among other things, she found the unconditional cash did provide a slight decrease in labor market participation among two groups. One group were young mothers who stepped back from the workforce to provide care to young children. I think it's hard to argue that that's not a good investment of their time. The other was actually of adolescents who had reduced labor market participation because they were staying in school longer. So again, two really powerful examples of things that I think generally in society we'd want to encourage and support. And even right now, I'll tell you in the United States context, this pandemic unemployment assistance the federal government's providing through the unemployment insurance mechanism, there's really no evidence that that's keeping people from going into the labor force and taking jobs. Now, having said that, this is a very unique circumstance. There's many reasons people may not be taking jobs right now, namely because they don't want to go to a dangerous work environment where they can catch COVID. Nonetheless, I think there was a worry that somehow we kind of just sitting at home. In fact, the evidence from the unconditional cash experiments across the developing world suggests that cash actually leads people to aggressively look for work, both working for firms and as entrepreneurs. So I think while there's going to continue to be evidence generated around this question, the evidence to date, I think, clearly suggests that providing people cash is not an inhibition for people to work. Quite the opposite.
Another question I think is pretty unique. They asked, will it decrease or disencourage international movement? So for example, if you have a city that has basic income or a country that has basic income, might it disincentivize folks from leaving that situation of unconditional basic income and perhaps go seek and develop their talent elsewhere where they will lose basic income?
That's a fascinating question. There's a lot of different angles to it. I mean, the questioner, or perhaps your kind of addition to the questioner's question, that it might inhibit people from pursuing opportunities elsewhere. The opposite could be true too. It could actually address concerns people have about migration and all the tensions we face about migration. I don't think we have any evidence right now to say that it will or won't inhibit people's movement. You could imagine, though, that if you're someplace with very few economic opportunities, that if you have a basic income to meet your basic needs, there's less of a critical imperative to seek employment elsewhere. Again, it's a bit of speculation. We just don't know. You know, the few examples of policies we have from around the world give us a limited guidance. For example, the state of Alaska, more than 30 years ago, implemented a basic income from oil revenue from that state. And by the way, that policy was implemented, led by a Republican governor of that state 30 plus years ago. Now, in that case, you actually have to be a resident of the state for a year to receive the income. But I don't think we have strong evidence to suggest that, you know, millions of people flocked to Alaska to receive that money. Granted, it was $2,000 to $3,000 a year. Nonetheless, if you're living very simply, particularly in a rural area, that's not a small amount of money. So I think we have to look to the frontiers here and wait to see whether how cash experiments at least bear out on immigration.
Great. So I think that wraps us up, Sean. Thank you, everybody, for following the Education Inside event. We have the last educational panel online tomorrow at 4 p.m. You're all welcome to join us again then. Thanks again, Sean. Please follow Talent Circulation Alliance's Facebook page for more coming events, and we will see you then.